My mother-in-law slid a thick manila envelope across the dining room table, looked at my husband, and told him he needed to see what was inside. She had secretly taken a sample from our 3-year-old daughter to run a DNA test, expecting the results to end my marriage. She had no idea that I had discovered her plan 2 weeks earlier, or that the document in her hands was about to blow up her own life instead. Welcome back to Payback Stories. I'm Ashley, and if you enjoy stories about family drama, betrayal, and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. Let's get into it. To understand how we ended up at that dinner table, you have to go back 7 years to the first time I met Barbara Palmer. I was 25 years old, and Matthew and I had been dating for about 4 months. He invited me over to his parents' house on a weekend in October. When Barbara opened the front door, she did not hug me. She offered a brief handshake and looked me up and down. Dinner was straightforward enough at first. We ate pot roast while his father, Robert, talked about fixing up his workbench in the garage. But halfway through the meal, Barbara shifted the conversation toward my background. She asked where I grew up, so I told her I grew up in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport and that my mother worked as a pediatric nurse. Then she asked about my father. I told her flatly that my father had walked out when I was 6 years old. Barbara nodded slowly, reached up to touch her earring, and said that must have been difficult. She said it with a specific tone that felt more like she was filing information away than showing sympathy. On the drive home, Matthew told me his mother liked me. I asked him if he was sure, and he laughed it off. That night was my first lesson in how Barbara operated. She was obsessed with origins and background. She asked Matthew where he bought the wine, who recommended it, and checked the bottle before pouring a glass. She was someone who liked to keep track of details and leverage them later. At the time, I did not realize she would eventually turn that habit against my daughter, but I made a mental note that Barbara was someone who kept score. Matthew and I got married 2 years later in a small ceremony near the coast with 40 guests. My mother flew in from Arizona. Barbara showed up wearing a cream-colored dress, which my maid of honor pointed out was a boundary test. I ignored it because I was marrying a solid man and did not care to start a feud over a dress. Our first year of marriage was relatively quiet. We rented a small house in Milford, about 40 minutes away from Barbara and Robert. It was close enough for family dinners on holidays, but far enough to give us room to live our lives. The problem was that Barbara did not respect boundaries. She started showing up at our house unannounced, usually on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons. We had given her a spare key for emergency situations, but she used it to walk through the side door whenever she felt like it. She would rearrange items on my counters, adjust my spice rack, or organize my coat closet. One afternoon, she completely reorganized my linen closet and left a sticky note telling me that sorting towels by color made them easier to find. I nodded, said thank you, and let it go. Matthew told me that was just how his mother showed care. His younger sister, Megan, was 24 at the time and still lived at home with Barbara. Megan orbited her mother completely. Every time Megan visited our house, Barbara would call Matthew later that evening with a full commentary on our home, what we cooked, and how we spent our money. I stayed quiet because I was still figuring out the family dynamics and did not want to create friction. At Thanksgiving that year, Barbara raised her glass for a toast. She looked around the table at Robert, Megan, Aunt Carol, and Uncle Thomas. Then she looked at me for a single second and said Matthew could have had anyone he wanted. The rest of the table chuckled, and I kept a neutral expression on my face, but I noted the slight. Our daughter, Hannah, was born 2 years into our marriage. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. When she was born, she had dark hair. Barbara held her in the hospital room and said the baby looked exactly like Matthew did as an infant. She sounded genuinely happy, and for a short window, I thought having a grandchild might soften her approach toward me. That period lasted about 6 months. Around 6 months, Hannah's hair began to change color. The dark hair started lightening into a light brown, then a deeper copper shade. By her first birthday, Hannah had bright red curls. I was not surprised by this at all. My mother has red hair, and my grandmother had the exact same shade. The genetics were clear on my side of the family. Barbara, however, viewed it as a contradiction. At Hannah's first birthday party, she stood near the high chair, reached out, and held one of Hannah's curls between her fingers. She asked out loud where the red hair came from. I explained that it was a recessive gene from my maternal line and that it often skips a generation. Barbara gave a short nod, smiled, and said it was interesting because red hair did not run anywhere in the Palmer family. She said it in a matter-of-fact tone, like she was pointing out a minor detail, but I caught the implication immediately. Nobody else at the party picked up on it, but I knew Barbara had already started building a narrative in her mind. Over the following year, her comments became more frequent. She never made direct accusations in public because that was not her style. Instead, she dropped subtle remarks during family visits. She would say Hannah looked unique, or remark that nobody on their side had that coloring, or ask if my family had Irish ancestry to explain it. I started keeping a record of these comments. Every time she made a remark about Hannah's appearance, I wrote down the date and the exact phrasing in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand. As an occupational therapist, I document client progress, behavioral patterns, and physical milestones every day. Documentation is second nature to me, so recording Barbara's comments was just a logical habit. In 6 months, I logged 15 separate instances. Megan joined in on the behavior. She took a photo of Hannah standing in Barbara's garden, posted it on her social media page, and added a caption saying how unique Hannah looked and wondering where she got her features. I showed the post to Matthew. He glanced at his phone, shrugged, and told me Megan was just making conversation. The rest of the extended family slowly changed how they acted around me. Uncle Thomas started avoiding small talk with me at family gatherings. Cousin Lauren stopped replying to my group texts. Aunt Carol, who is Barbara's sister, began watching me closely whenever I was in the room. Barbara was not making direct legal accusations yet. She was creating an atmosphere of doubt through repetition and silence. Things escalated on a Tuesday in April. Matthew had an all-day site inspection 2 hours away, and I had a late shift at the clinic working with a young pediatric client who needed extra physical therapy time. Barbara offered to watch Hannah for the day. I dropped Hannah off at 10 in the morning with her bag, snacks, extra clothes, and her favorite green sippy cup that she used every single day. When I returned at 6 to pick her up, the sippy cup was missing from her bag. I asked Barbara where it was, and she told me she had thrown it away because it looked worn down. I had purchased that cup 3 weeks prior. I decided not to argue, thanked her for watching Hannah, and packed up the car. While grabbing Hannah's jacket off the kitchen counter, I noticed a small clear plastic bag sitting near the table, similar to the bags used for collecting small items. Barbara stepped in front of me quickly, picked it up, and placed it inside a drawer. On her hallway desk, I caught a quick glimpse of a sealed manila envelope sitting behind her stack of mail. I did not assemble the whole picture that night. The missing cup, the small bag, and the envelope seemed like separate details. I went home, put Hannah to bed, and focused on my week. But my professional training revolves around noticing anomalies, and my brain kept returning to those details. At my job, I work with children who have severe motor delays and physical injuries. My income is $72,000 a year. I paid my own way through graduate school, earned my professional license, and put money away into a savings account and a college fund for my daughter every month. I highlight this because later, when Barbara attempted to portray me as a financially dependent outsider who used her son, my actual records proved otherwise. 3 weeks after the missing cup incident, my office phone rang while I was sanitizing equipment between therapy sessions. The caller identified herself as Kelly from Geneva Labs, a regional genetic testing facility. She said she was calling to verify parental consent for a DNA sample submitted under my daughter's name, Hannah Palmer. I held the phone and told her I had never submitted any sample. Kelly explained that a woman named Barbara Palmer had submitted the test kit, listing herself as the child's grandmother. However, laboratory policy required verified authorization from a legal parent before processing samples for minors. Kelly asked if I wanted to authorize the processing or cancel the request. I told her to cancel it immediately. My hands were firm, but my chest felt heavy. I sat in the therapy room for 4 minutes, focused on my breathing, and looked at the anatomical charts on the wall to center myself. Then I searched for a family law attorney in the area and scheduled a consultation for that afternoon. I met with an attorney named Victoria Nguyen in her office in New Haven. Victoria had over 14 years of experience in family law. I laid out the timeline, the 15 logged comments, the missing sippy cup, and the phone call from the testing lab. Victoria listened quietly and took notes. She told me that under state law, a grandparent has zero legal authority to order genetic testing on a minor child without explicit written consent from a legal parent. She stated that submitting a minor's biological sample under false pretenses violated privacy statutes and breached the lab's operational terms. I asked her if I should confront Barbara right away or tell Matthew. Victoria advised me against both options. She explained that if I told Matthew immediately, he would likely call his mother to prevent a conflict. Barbara would make excuses, apologize superficially, and push the issue under the rug, allowing the pattern of subtle disrespect to continue indefinitely. Victoria suggested that if I wanted to end the behavior permanently, I needed to let Barbara proceed with whatever plan she had arranged, so her actions would be fully exposed in front of witnesses. I paid Victoria her $350 consultation fee. It was the most effective money I have ever spent. When I left the law office, I called Geneva Labs back to confirm in writing that the sample was canceled and that a permanent hold was placed on my daughter's name. Then I drove to daycare to pick up Hannah. When she ran to the door with her red curls bouncing, I picked her up and resolved that I would protect her from this nonsense once and for all. Over the next several days, I researched how DNA testing services handle submissions. Clinical laboratories like Geneva have strict regulatory protocols, which is why they flagged the lack of parental consent. However, commercially available consumer ancestry databases use direct-to-consumer kits where consent is handled via online checkboxes. I decided to investigate whether Barbara had used a consumer platform as well. I accessed public social media records and checked old posts. A few months earlier, Megan had shared an article about consumer DNA testing and matching algorithms. Barbara had left a comment under the post stating that the process was very interesting. I remembered that Megan had once set up Barbara's tablet and mentioned that Barbara used the same basic password format for everything, which was Hannah's birthday followed by her initials. I navigated to the consumer platform's public search portal, entered Barbara's publicly listed contact email, and requested an account verification check. The platform indicated that an active user profile existed under that email. Using the platform's public profile tools, I searched for connected public matches associated with that account's geographic cluster. A high-probability match was listed as an open profile, David M., age 36, residing in Portland, Oregon. The system identified him as a high-percentile match consistent with a half-uncle or full first cousin to any sample submitted through that account. A half-uncle relationship meant that David shared a biological parent with either Matthew or me. Since my own DNA was not in Barbara's account, the biological link was entirely on the Palmer side. That meant either Robert had an unknown child or Barbara did. I saved the match details, documented the screen records, and emailed the file to Victoria. The next morning, Victoria called me back. She noted that if the genetic match was accurate, there was an undisclosed biological child in the immediate family line. I conducted further public records research on David M. His full public name was David Michael Callahan, born in June 1990 in Hartford, Connecticut, and adopted through a private agency. On his public ancestry profile, he had enabled the open contact feature, stating he was adopted at birth and interested in identifying his biological origins. I did the basic math. David was born in June 1990 when Barbara was 25 years old. Barbara and Robert were married in 1992. Matthew was born later in 1992. Barbara had given birth to a child 2 years before marrying Robert, placed the child up for adoption, and never disclosed it to her husband or her son. I checked the shared match list on David's open profile again. Another connected profile was listed under the name Margaret Ruth, designated as a probable aunt. Aunt Carol's full legal name was Carol Ruth. Carol had known about Barbara's secret child for 36 years. Barbara had spent years obsessing over my daughter's red hair and questioning my fidelity because she was terrified of genetic truths coming to light. She projected her own decades-old secret onto me and attempted to use my daughter as a distraction. 2 days later, Barbara called Matthew to invite us to a mandatory Sunday dinner at her house. She mentioned that she was having Robert invite Uncle Thomas, Aunt Carol, Megan, and Cousin Lauren. Her voice was steady and deliberate. I told Matthew we would be there. I spent Friday organizing my documentation folder. I printed out the log of Barbara's comments, the written verification from Geneva Labs regarding the unauthorized sample, the the civil privacy statute summaries from Victoria, and the public match report for David Callahan. I saved digital backups to a secure drive. On Saturday night, I gave Hannah her bath. While I was drying her hair, she asked me why her grandmother always touched her curls whenever we visited. I told her it was because her hair was special, put her pajamas on, and read her a story until she fell asleep. When Matthew came upstairs, he mentioned that his mother seemed unusually focused on Sunday dinner. I looked at him, knowing he had spent his life trusting his mother's narratives, and told him we would see how the evening went. On Sunday afternoon, we drove 40 minutes north to Barbara's house. Hannah fell asleep in her car seat during the drive. When we pulled into the driveway, cars belonging to Robert, Megan, Uncle Thomas, and Aunt Carol were already parked outside. Barbara opened the front door, greeted Matthew with a brief hug, gave me a quick nod, and told me to put Hannah upstairs in the guest room for a nap. I carried Hannah upstairs, laid her on the bed with a blanket, and came back down to the dining room. The entire family was gathered around the table. Robert was sitting near the window, Uncle Thomas was next to him, Megan was checking her phone continuously, and Aunt Carol was sitting near the china cabinet with a rigid posture. On the hallway table near the entryway sat the thick manila envelope I had seen weeks earlier. We ate dinner in near silence. Robert tried to make small talk about a lawnmower part he had ordered, but Barbara kept the momentum of the table focused on her schedule. Aunt Carol barely touched her meal. Megan kept checking the clock on her phone every few minutes. 20 minutes into the meal, Barbara put her fork down, dabbed her mouth with a napkin, and stood up. She walked to the hallway table, picked up the manila envelope, and walked back to the head of the dining table. She held the envelope in front of her and placed it directly in front of Matthew. She told Matthew to open it, stating that as his mother, she felt he deserved to know the truth about his family. The dining room went completely quiet. Robert asked her what she was doing. Barbara ignored him, kept her eyes on Matthew, and declared that she had taken the initiative to get a DNA test done for Hannah because she believed the child did not share the family's traits. She stated explicitly that red hair did not exist anywhere in the Palmer bloodline, and that Matthew needed to know if Hannah was actually his daughter. Megan leaned forward in her chair. Cousin Lauren looked down at her hands. Aunt Carol stared fixatedly at her plate. Matthew looked at the envelope, then looked up at his mother. His jaw was set. He picked up the envelope, broke the top seal, and pulled out the printed document inside. He read the first page in silence for roughly 20 seconds. Barbara stood at the head of the table with a firm expression, fully expecting the paperwork to validate her suspicions. Matthew looked up at her and stated flatly that the results confirmed he was Hannah's biological father, with a paternity probability of 99.9998%. Barbara stopped moving. She stepped forward, reached out her hand, and said that could not be correct and that she needed to see the paperwork. Matthew pulled the document back and told her she had done enough. Megan tried to speak up, asking if the lab could have made a processing error, but Matthew cut her off instantly and told her to be quiet. It was the first time in his life he had ever raised his voice at his sister. Barbara reached up to touch her earring, her hand shaking slightly, and repeated that the coloring made no sense. I sat forward at my end of the table, kept my hands folded, and addressed Barbara directly. I told her the results were completely accurate. I informed the entire table that I had known about the test for 2 weeks because Geneva Labs had called me directly to report an unauthorized attempt to submit our daughter's sample without parental consent. Robert turned to Barbara and asked if she had actually tried to run a DNA test on their granddaughter behind our backs. I stated clearly that under Connecticut state law, a grandparent cannot legally authorize medical or genetic testing on a minor without written parental authorization. I added that my attorney had already prepared the necessary legal notices regarding the privacy violation. Barbara's face flushed red, then went pale. She attempted to claim she was only trying to protect her son, but Robert looked at her with complete disbelief. I kept my voice level and told the table that the paternity confirmation was not the only piece of information present in the background search results. Matthew looked down at the paperwork again. I told him to look at page 4. Matthew flipped to the final sheet, which contained the familial match summary from the commercial database search attached to the file history. He read the entry out loud, slowly. It listed a potential match for David M., age 36, located in Portland, Oregon, identified as a half-uncle to Hannah. Matthew stopped reading, looked at the page, and then looked at Barbara. He asked her who David was, noting that a half-uncle meant the man was either his half-brother or my half-brother. I stated clearly that David was not related to my side of the family. Matthew asked Barbara directly who David Callahan was. Barbara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She gripped the edge of the table. Aunt Carol set her glass down hard on the table and stood up, telling Barbara not to say anything more. Robert stood up from his chair, causing it to slide back against the floor. He ordered Carol to sit down and demanded that Barbara answer the question immediately. Barbara looked at Carol, who shook her head. Tears started running down Barbara's face. She looked at Matthew and said it had happened before she met Robert, when she was 25 years old and unprepared. Matthew stared at her and asked if she had a child she had never told him about. Barbara admitted she had been scared and had placed the baby for adoption in Hartford in 1990. Matthew asked if she had kept this secret from his father for 34 years while telling Carol. Robert stood motionless at the end of the table, holding the back of his chair. He asked her quietly if she had been lying to him for their entire 34 years of marriage. Barbara tried to reach for his hand, but Robert stepped back. The entire table sat in absolute silence as Barbara cried. The narrative she had constructed to control the family had completely collapsed in front of everyone she had invited to watch. Matthew picked up the test results, looked at Barbara, and repeated the exact words she had used 20 minutes earlier, telling her he thought she needed to see this. Megan started crying at her spot at the table, realizing how completely she had been manipulated into participating in her mother's scheme. She admitted she had believed Barbara when she claimed to have proof. Matthew looked at his mother and told her that he was actually the one carrying the recessive red hair gene in the family. He pulled out his phone, swiped through his digital photo storage, and laid the screen on the table. It was a digitized photograph from 1982, showing a young woman with natural, bright red hair standing in a yard. Matthew explained that he had found the old photo in a box of records in the attic a year earlier. It was a picture of Barbara at age 19. Uncle Thomas leaned in, looked at the phone screen, and asked Barbara if she had natural red hair. Barbara unclipped her earring, set it down on the table, and admitted that she had started dyeing her hair brown at age 19 because she hated the color. The red hair that Barbara claimed did not exist in the Palmer family was her own natural hair color. She had spent 40 years hiding it with salon treatments, and when her granddaughter was born with the exact same hair, Barbara viewed the child's appearance as a constant threat to her secret. There was nothing left to discuss. Robert walked to the coat rack, put his jacket on, and said he was going for a drive. He left the house without looking back at Barbara. Matthew turned to me and told me to get Hannah. I went upstairs, picked up Hannah while she was still sleeping, and brought her downstairs wrapped in her blanket. Extended family members were already exiting through the front door in total silence. Barbara stood by the entryway, her eyes swollen, and asked Matthew not to leave like this. Matthew looked at her, told her that she had wanted a public scene instead of an honest conversation, and walked out to the car. We loaded Hannah into her car seat, got into our vehicle, and drove away from the house. We drove in silence for 10 minutes before Matthew asked me how long I had known about the test and David. I told him I found out about the test 2 weeks prior and identified David 8 days ago. He asked me why I had not told him privately. I explained plainly that if I had brought it up privately, Barbara would have made excuses, cried, and convinced him to sweep it under the rug as usual. He needed to see her actions play out fully to recognize the pattern for what it was. Matthew held the steering wheel, nodded slowly, and acknowledged that I was right. He reached across the console, held my hand, and thanked me for forcing the truth into the open. The following morning, Matthew called Barbara and told her not to contact me or Hannah until he was ready to speak to her again. On Tuesday, Robert called Matthew to let him know he was staying at Uncle Thomas's house while he figured out how to proceed after 34 years of buried secrets. On Wednesday, Megan sent me a long text message apologizing for her behavior, admitting she had blindly followed her mother's lead and acknowledging that she had been wrong. I replied with a brief text thanking her for the apology. On Thursday, Victoria mailed a formal legal cease and desist letter to Barbara, officially warning her against any further unauthorized actions regarding our daughter. On Friday, Matthew located David Callahan's public contact info and sent him a brief email introducing himself as his half-brother. David responded within 2 hours, stating he had been searching for biological family for 7 years. They arranged a video call the following evening. I stayed in the living room with Hannah while Matthew talked to David at the kitchen table. Hearing his brother's voice for the first time, Matthew broke down and cried. David was emotional as well. They looked almost identical, sharing the exact same jawline and features. 2 weeks later, Barbara came to our front door unannounced. I had already changed the code on the side door lock, so she had to knock on the front. She stood on the porch, looking drained, and tried to explain that her parents had forced her to give up her child in 1990. Matthew stepped up beside me and told her that while her past was difficult, she had no right to project her guilt onto his wife and daughter. Barbara turned to me and asked if there was any way she could still see Hannah. I looked at her and stated my terms clearly. I told her she could have a relationship with Hannah on our schedule, under our supervision, and that she would never be left alone with our daughter again. Barbara nodded, accepted the conditions without arguing, and walked back to her car. Over the next several months, the family slowly reorganized itself around the truth. Robert eventually returned home after 2 months of living separately, but he established strict terms regarding total honesty in their marriage. Barbara stopped dyeing her hair, letting it grow out in its natural gray and white tones. Matthew flew out to Portland 6 months later to meet David in person. They spent 4 hours talking at a local diner, and later that summer, David and his family visited us in Connecticut so our daughters could play together in the backyard. I still keep the manila envelope inside my desk drawer at home. I keep it not out of anger, but as a reminder that when someone attempts to use a fake narrative to tear your family down, the truth is always stronger. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Payback Stories for a new family drama story every day, and I'll see you in the next one.